Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Darren Walker. I am sitting here at the Ford Foundation. I am a black man with a bald head wearing seersucker blue and a blue and white check shirt with my lucite frame glasses. And welcome to the Ford Foundation, Elizabeth.
That was quite a level of detail. Hello, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Alexander. I'm so happy to be here with my beloved friend Darren Walker and with all of you, some of whom are my beloved colleagues, past, present, and eternal. And I am a black woman with curly hair and some big old hoops and a red lip. And here we are.
Well, we are here because Dr. Elizabeth Alexander is brilliant, and that goes without saying if you have followed her career and you have read the many extraordinary poems, books, essays from the New Yorker to the New York Times to Poetry Magazine, so many other places and spaces where we have luxuriated in her beautiful writing. But today, we are going to talk about a particular publication, the Trayvon Generation, that was released last year to much acclaim. Time magazine said it was the book we've been waiting for. The New York Times absolutely salivated over the book in its review. And I want to talk about this book and to situate your quest. You really say that this book was a calling and that you had to write this book. Why in this moment was it so essential and so urgent for you to write the Trayvon Generation?
Well, I had been thinking for a very long time about our young people. And when I say our young people, I am talking about people who are of my son's generation, now 22 and 24. I'm talking about the young people who, for my decades as a college professor, I mentored through those years of their teenhood. And what I was seeing in so many of our black and brown young kids especially, is that the effect of the violence, the race-based violence that we as a society have witnessed in an absolutely, not only increasing quantity, but most importantly, over and over again, now viewable on our phones, viewable repeatedly. So all of these deaths that have become iconic, if you look back to Emmett Till, his mother in 1955 made the extraordinary decision when her son was dredged up from the Tallahatchie River that she would take his body to Chicago and let it be seen in an open casket in that church, and then let Jet Magazine photograph it and show it. And that was a way that we understood that we were still at risk, that black people were still at risk. And some people say that that move catalyzed the civil rights movement. Rodney King, when that videotape was made by George Holliday from across the street when Rodney King was beaten by police, that was the first time that we saw a viral video. But in this contemporary era, we see these, on our phone, on the cover of the paper, and our kids are seeing it outside of our presence. They're seeing it sometimes hundreds of times. I wanted to think about the effect of that trauma. I wanted to think about what we might describe as a certain kind of cool as being depression, as being trauma. And I wanted also to think about, in this generation that I call the Trayvon Generation, which I can read you a description of how I think about them. I wanted to think about their resilience, their art, their music, their videos, and how are they finding joy and self-expression when their lives are under siege.
One of the reasons the book, I believe, was so acclaimed was the innovative and unusual way in which you integrated various forms of media and art and music and dance, drama, as reference points to illuminate this idea of the Trayvon generation and trauma, but connecting it to a historical narrative arc. And it's fascinating how you're able to draw on and bring into stark relief ways to illustrate this. I want to talk about Zora Neale Hurston. And you really capture it, and the chapter where you talk about Zora and Alice Walker, and you talk about how Alice Walker felt that she had to do the work of remembering, and the importance of remembering those who have often been forgotten, erased, and overlooked. Talk about that.
Yes, well, the larger argument is that if we have to continue to assert that Black Lives Matter, if we have to continue to assert, and every day, I mean, you know, read the story on the front page of the New York Times today of the woman whose baby daughter died, and she was charged with murder and spent a year in jail because of people's belief that Black people don't suffer, that we would cause this kind of harm to each other. She was a year in prison for the death that she had nothing to do with of her baby daughter. And that article goes into medical examiners and how few people of color and women of color are medical examiners, and about widespread beliefs that continue. Black people do not bruise, Black people do not feel pain in the same way, which, as you know, I also explore in the book. So I say that just to say we have to continually assert that our lives matter. We have to continually assert that we are actually fully human beings. And that's where it starts. So once we've established that we are fully human beings, what lets us be remembered if we are not in monuments and memorials and all of the spaces of commemoration? I say that Black poets and Black artists and Black musicians and Black community and Black folk have made sure that we will not be forgotten. So the example of Zora Neale Hurston is that this great American writer died in a state of penury and was buried in an unmarked grave in a weedy Florida field. And Alice Walker would not let this stand. She knew that her writing life and the writing life of so many, including myself, depended on a Zora Neale Hurston having written the incredible book she did. And so Alice Walker wrote about going to Florida, to the weedy field, calling out her name, "Zora, are you there? Zora, are you there?" And putting a marker where she was buried saying, "Zora Neale Hurston, a genius of the South." Interestingly, before she died, Zora Neale Hurston wrote to W.E.B. Du Bois, saying to him, being dean of Negro letters as you are, and Zora's letters, if you haven't read Zora Neale Hurston's letters, they are rich and so entertaining and spectacular. But she said, "Why don't you start this project, a cemetery for the illustrious Negro dead?" And that's where the chapter title comes from. A place where Black people can be remembered. She said, make it beautiful, bring our sculptors, bring our artists, have it in Florida. She's, of course, from Florida. She identified where it should be, talked about the flora, the fauna, here's why it would be beautiful. She goes on a whole wonderful thing. Du Bois answers dismissively. So Du Bois is both like hero and anti-hero in this book. Like sometimes he's, as Zora called him, a goateed, haughty, egotistical
He was, and he was those things.
And he also is,
yes.
One of our great geniuses
Exactly.
who is invoked in the beginning, with this idea of like the problem is still the problem of the
Yes.
color line. So all of that is to say that, how ironic that Hurston put forth this beautiful plan to say we have to remember ourselves. We have to remember ourselves in space. We have to remember ourselves beautifully. We have to call our own names. If I may just
Please.
read a section.
Please.
Because it ties to other things. I write in that same chapter about driving through New Haven, Connecticut, a city where I've spent as much time as I've lived anywhere in my life, a city very dear to me. driving down Dixwell Avenue. So for those of you who know New Haven, Connecticut, Dixwell Avenue takes you through the Black community, and coming upon a traffic stoppage and seeing people spilling out of a church, and all of them wearing, in the same goldenrod color, hoodies. And as I inched by, I saw that on the front of those hoodies was a picture of a smiling young Black man, 15 or 16 by my guess. That young man was the reason they were gathered. He was the boy who had died. Black communities are full of people wearing t-shirts and hoodies with the faces of young Black people on them whom their communities mourn and remember. I do not know more about this boy or this story or how he died, but this is one way Black people live, die, and are mourned in New Haven. History is marked by what was there and is no longer, and is kept by the way we remember. We honor our beloved who all too often live abbreviated lives and die for reasons related to race by calling their names and wearing their faces on our bodies. In literal cemeteries, bodies are buried, and the places carry the memory of the ritual farewells that have occurred there, where we weep and hear the sound of shovels breaking dirt in 4 seasons. Then we mark the ground with headstones to make places to return to. Over the years, cemeteries themselves tell stories and become history. So, to me, the point is, rather than wait around for our monuments, we have made monuments in other forms, and in our poetry, and in our art, and in all of the ways that we ritualize. I mean, I talked from there about a roadside memorial for Sandra Bland.
Yes, which
people
I was in Prairie View a month ago. Amazing.
And I imagine, to this day, still being added to.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it remains in that community a force for mobilizing thought about this very issue. You said something that just triggered for me this idea as you were describing these tropes, such as, well, we don't feel pain. I was reminded of that because, as you know, I was in Monticello this weekend for Juneteenth, but I raise it because at this gathering of 400 descendants of enslaved people, there were 2 branches of families who were enslaved, and it was common for the slave owners to sell members of the family. And in this case, one family, the mother was sold 5 miles away down the river to another family. And the reason Jefferson wrote was because Black people didn't feel love the way, and because we were presumed as subhuman, that the emotional capacity that white people possessed, we did not possess. And therefore, it was a way of rationalizing breaking up families. I mean, you just sold the mother, and she's now 5 miles. It came up in the context of Annette Gordon Reed talking about her husband convincing Jefferson to sell him to this other owner where his wife now was. And Jefferson ultimately relented. But Annette's point was, Jefferson knew the reason he sold him was because he knew that this man loved his wife, and that he was sick without her. And so to assert that our subhuman status rendered us incapable of the emotional complexity of white Americans, the reality of that through line through the whole eugenics movement and other forms of cultural narratives and practices makes possible these horrible stories, like a woman being put in prison for a year. And I think you really capture, to me, this ties to your point about, as a mother, you wished, and your work for your two boys was that your love would be their armor, that you would enable them through deep and profound love to be prepared for that world. And yet you write.
It's not enough. It's not enough. I mean, you know, to Jefferson for a moment, I think that example, to me, raises the question of the complex psychology of, you know, the savagery of the subhuman people who treat us as subhuman, separate families, you know, build their wealth on our labor and leave the illusion that they somehow earned it themselves. What is the psychology? What is that psychology? You know, Jefferson, in Notes of the State of Virginia, as you know, also wrote, "No black has ever uttered a thought above the level of plain narration." So, you know, black people to him in that text were, right? You know, I mean, you know, no thought above the level of plain narration. And yet to Jefferson's own contradictions, of course, you know, it's really very, very extraordinary. I mean, the thing that concerns me is that we understand, and that's why there's a chapter that's not about critical race theory per se, but is about the great scholar John Hope Franklin in the 1960s, when he is commissioned to write a book of American history for the state of California. And he writes a history book. It's called Land of the Free. And the minute that the book comes out, which of course includes the story not just of, you know, white men on horses, but also, you know, Native history and African American history and nascent civil rights history. This Land of the Free committee made film strips, called him a communist, started an entire campaign to do away with the book, said that the book was designed to provoke white guilt, and that was why it could no longer exist. So, I mean, it's really exactly the idea that if you know, that's why you keep history from people, is so that they can allow themselves to continue to believe mythologies that not only are some people inferior, but that other people are superior.
Well, and one of the things you've talked about is black excellence, and how it is unrecognized. And going back to Jefferson, this isn't about Jefferson, but you know, I love talking about Jefferson. The reality of the whole Phillis Wheatley debacle. I mean, his and John Adams' unwillingness to believe that Phillis Wheatley actually wrote those poems.
Yep.
I mean, they took this woman to court and accused her of being a fraud, because they said it's just simply impossible that this young woman, could write this poetry.
And made her write them in front of them at a little desk, which as a poet, I take the greatest affront. We don't let people in our process that way. The idea that you'd have to create with like all of these people watching you in a courtroom is, you know, is extraordinary, like you were, you know, sort of a trained monkey. I mean, it's incredible. And I guess, you know, just back to this subhumanity and feeling, this chapter towards the end, and here's where also I would mention that what I'm really happy about in this book, and I'm really happy that you'll have copies of this book, is that I wanted it to be a conversation with some of our absolutely extraordinary visual artists. And I wanted so this section I'm about to read has, you can't all the way see it, but you can look at it. This is by the great Robert Pruitt, and this beautiful man who he's painted has pale blue stars on his torso. So that's the kind of like magical, mystical, beautiful part of it. And the way that I thought about the art was I did not want it to be literally illustrative of what I was writing. I wanted it to be in conversation, sometimes contrapuntal, sometimes a moment where you stop, sometimes a text that you might read through on its own. In other words, like take it as a picture book. Sometimes something that you might go back to. That chapter I just described with John Hope Franklin has Amy Sherald's great painting where the African-American gentleman is wearing a shirt with an American flag and a Texas cowboy hat. So like, okay, what does that make us think about who's American and what Americanness is? So the visual art is part of the actual reading experience. So that's why I want to show you that. And then, you know, just to this, Whether the Negro Sheds Tears, and to bring us back to Du Bois, it starts from a letter that was written to Du Bois in the early 19th century from a scholar at Clark University who says, "Dear Sir," this to Du Bois, 1905, We are pursuing an investigation here on the subject of crying as an expression of the emotions, and should like very much to learn about its peculiarities among the colored people. We have been referred to you as a person competent to give us information upon the subject. We desire especially to know about the following salient aspects. 1, whether the Negro sheds tears. 2, if so, under what general conditions: anger, fear, shame, pain, sorrow, etc. And it goes from there. And Du Bois writes back, the Negro sheds tears. And so I moved that forward to watching the trial of Derek Chauvin, the police officer who, as we know, murdered George Floyd by kneeling on his neck for over 9 minutes. And I talk about the pulmonologist, you might remember, named Dr. Martin Tobin, who testified and took us inexorably through what he witnessed and the moment at which the life left George Floyd's body. And so here I write, Charles McMillian, a neighborhood elder at 61, weeps on the stand and cannot stop. I feel helpless. I don't have a mama either. I understand him. George Floyd's brother Phil O'Nees cries on the stand when shown a photograph of himself as a child with his older brother George. He says, George was a big mama's boy. I cry a lot, but George, he loved his mom. He showed us how to treat our mom, how to respect our mom. He loved her so much. All the black men at this trial seemed to cry. And the young people say they should have done something to stop it. The young man at the store who was the cashier for Floyd's transaction wishes he hadn't questioned the counterfeit bill. Black people, including unimaginably brave Darnella Frazier, say, I should have intervened, I should have stopped it. The young people assume responsibility for the horror they could not prevent. George Floyd cried for his mother as he died. I see black elders cry watching this trial, including my own father. As millions waited for the verdict in the Chauvin trial, police killed a 16-year-old girl in Columbus, Ohio, Ma'Khia Bryant. In tears are sorrow, in tears are grief, in tears are anger, in tears are rage, in tears swallowed are cancer, hypertension, respiratory ailments, in tears swallowed is disease, in tears shed is sometimes no relief on the other side. Black tears unshed and swallowed every day, and black tears shed. And that's a very short chapter, but I felt that I could have written that chapter for the rest of my life.
You talk about trauma a lot in this book. It is really about the trauma of this generation. But you had there were so many new words and terms and phrases in this book, but one that caught me was this idea of delayed comprehension. And you talk about being a professor at Yale and going into the corporation's boardroom and the most important room on campus and being invited there and having meetings and the various roles you played as a department chair, et cetera, and seeing a portrait of Elihu Yale on many occasions, and then something happened.
Yes. The phrase, the shock of delayed comprehension, I borrow from a terrific poet named Adrian Sue, Chinese-American poet who grew up in Georgia, and who writes about Stone Mountain, as I do as well, which I recently saw for the first time. So I have to say something about Stone Mountain, and then we'll get to Yale.
I love you have Kara Walker in it, too.
Yes,
that's another,
Kara Walker facing Stone Mountain, but you know, the largest bas-relief sculpture on Earth, Stone Mountain. Okay.
Georgia.
Obviously the largest Confederate monument on Earth, made by the same people who sculpted Mount Rushmore on stolen native land, you know, by the by, paid for and made by Klans people. And it is Georgia's largest tourist attraction. It's a park, and you go there to hike and recreate. And what I learned on my visit there just a few weeks ago, I went there with my oldest son until he made us leave. He's like, all right, Mom, like, you understand that we got to go now. But, they also have a walk of secession there that I didn't know about. And they have a, sort of plantation village that I didn't know about. And they have a laser show every Saturday night that is projected onto the Stonewall Jackson Robert E. Lee bas-relief sculpture. It is extraordinary, but what was fascinating on that trip was what happened before I went to Stone Mountain when I said to Black people, friends, people who I saw there when visiting, I'm going to Stone Mountain. And so several of them said, like, oh, when I was growing up, we weren't allowed to go to Stone Mountain. Like, you're going to Stone Mountain? That it was somewhere that you weren't supposed to go. But also that people told me, more than one person said, when I was growing up, the Klan used to burn their crosses, and because of the topography of the city, you could see it burning through the night from miles and miles away. So it was a stage, not just about the site itself, but for the entire city to see white supremacy alive and enacted, ever so long after the Civil War had ended. So that was Stone Mountain. Go forward to, and Adrian Sue, as a Chinese American growing up there, said, oh my God, we went there, we played, we picnicked, we frolicked. And it was the shock of delayed comprehension when I realized these are Confederates, these are white supremacists. I'm frolicking amongst the assertion of the ongoing value of white supremacy. And I think in all the conversations I've had about this book, I feel so excited that Adrian's phrase is proving useful to many, many people, because sometimes we just don't see. So to being, an official person in the president's, boardroom, having all my meetings, doing my job, being a department chair, here's this portrait of Elihu Yale. He's the namesake of the university. Of course, that's what you expect to see at the end. Years in, middle of a meeting, I look up and I see the brown, shackled figure to his left. I see his property serving him, and I'd never seen that before. And then to think, oh my God, the president and these people with these other jobs, they're in this room every day, and they haven't seen it. Now, here's what's fascinating about memory. When I started writing and researching, and when Martha Scott Burton, who is here, helped me research all of this, she was like, well, actually, there's two paintings. One of them is with the figure who probably is an Indian figure, and Elihu Yale was head of the East India Company at some point, and he is shackled and he is handing a letter. But I said, no, I'm remembering a portrait. I'm remembering a little boy. I'm remembering a boy of African descent with a collar. And as we researched further, indeed there is a second portrait with that boy that was not in the president's room. I was an undergraduate at Yale. It was in the dining hall for one of the residential colleges from 1980 to 1984 when I was in college. So I ate many, many meals under this little boy, shackled. And what I write about, and what you might have heard about, is the stained glass in Calhoun College at Yale, the college formerly known as Calhoun College, now Grace Hopper College, that had stained glass of enslaved people picking cotton, and that a worker in the dining hall one day said, this is a hostile work environment. And he took a broomstick. Now, he was arrested. He was fired. And eventually the charges were dropped because someone said the phrase hostile work environment, and things went from there. And he came back. But in thinking about someone who works in the dining hall serving the students, the servants who are being served, the students, like myself, who were not what was envisioned. I mean, when I went to college there, it wasn't just that, black folks hadn't been there that long. Women had only been there for 5 minutes. And the unquestioning way in which that was venerated and celebrated What I love about that portrait is the great Courtney Martin, director of the British Art Center, said, okay, we're going to do something with this. We're going to show this painting, and in the wall label, we're going to say, and when you look at, like, here's the whole story, and it's going to say, we still don't have the boy's name, but we are searching for it. It's going to mark that absence. And and the wall label says, and when you look at this painting, center the boy. Try that, center the boy. And then the next thing that happens, which is why art, saves all things, is that the painter Titus Kaphar makes a painting where he sort of paints a version of that, but puts the boy in the center and sort of shreds the background and calls the picture Enough About You. And so he literally centers the boy. So I think that, all of these are really, that's why art had to be in the book, but that's also why I think we are responding. We are telling the story in so many creative ways. We are talking back in so many creative ways. And I think that, sometimes we don't see because it's hard to see. And so once we see, what do we do with that? What does it mean not to unsee?
And how we insert into spaces to demand accountability and to demand that we engage in complexity. Back to Monticello before Q&A, we commissioned Titus to install a picture in Jefferson's parlor, and it's delicious. It is a picture of a regal black man, but the face is it is without features other than heavy, heavy, heavy black paint that is layered, and it's positioned in the center of Jefferson's parlor. And without that painting, you have the experience that the original Monticello society wanted you to see, which was Jefferson's beautiful parlor with all of his classical forms of literature and architecture and all of the things that were about the mythology of Jefferson. And in my speech, I referenced the mythology of Jefferson and how Jefferson was so much a creator of that mythology by ensuring, as he did successfully, that he would be remembered for three things on his tombstone: the Declaration of Independence, the religious rights, separation of church and state, and the University of Virginia. But I asserted that there had to be a fourth one, which was the legacy of slavery. I mean, he can't be, he doesn't have a right to demand that he be remembered for these three things without being remembered for the fourth. And that's what Titus's art does, is he inserts the fourth. And it makes it a much more interesting, complex tableau to walk into that parlor and to see that picture. It really, it just, to your point, and you talk so much in here about art and the brilliance among the many remarkable things about this book is the way you just integrate all of this. Just so many of my favorite artists are, it truly is like flashcards for me to just go through and see. No, truly, this is a flashcardable book. But we have to go to Q&A because we could talk, you and I, for long periods of time, as we often do. So I want to encourage you to please just come ask Elizabeth a question. I know this is an audience of people who, as I look around, and I know many of you, there are not many wallflowers in this room. And so please don't be a wallflower and ask Professor Alexander a question. And I know for some of you, you may not want to get up, but we do want everyone to hear. And if you feel you can speak loudly, you can do that too.
And while we wait for people to come to the mic, there's many more things to say, so that's great. I see you. I would say that also I did want to mention Angola Prison. Because that's another chapter of the book, and that was a trip that that trip to New Orleans that we took together. And, going to Angola Prison and seeing, back to this ongoing question of, as a society, if we fail to see each other as human beings, what it was to go into a group of incarcerated men there. And 90% of the people who go into Angola Prison die there. 90% of the people who go in there die there. And listening in on a writing group and listening to the compellingness with which people were writing and talking about their lives and thinking about Jackie Semel's project, which is photographed in here, which I thank you, Margaret Morton, for introducing me to. Her incredible, incredible Herman's House, where she had an ongoing pen pal relationship with Herman Wallace, who was one of the Angola prisoners who was in the Panther Party and was incarcerated in solitary for 40, the number's in here, it's in decades and decades and decades. And Jackie communicated with him by letter and said, Herman, if you had a home, if I could build you a home, what would your home look like? And they had long, beautiful conversations about, he's like, oh, I would have, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman would be on the wall here, and I'd have Black Panther on the bottom of my pool, and I'd have like the martini set up over here, and I would have, he described it and described it and described it. And she built a maquette of that house for him. And she designed that house, designed it to make it, and was ready to make that house for him. And he was finally exonerated and released from prison. And she met him, and he spent time with his family, and he died 3 days later. And so I tell that story, to ask about our humanity when we can be asked the question, what do you picture when you picture your home? And under those circumstances, and what did it mean for this artist, this white woman artist, to listen to his deepest dreams and to try to make that in some way real for him? I think that, that as a use for art, I found very, very powerful. So I just wanted to mention, Angola as a way of thinking about what is one of the most egregious modern-day examples of our society's ability to dehumanize so many of us because of the color of our skin. Yes?
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for today and for all the work that you do on our behalf and just the labor that you do on behalf of the community and the culture. And I feel like you just set up my question quite beautifully with the Angola recounting. My actual question is, do you believe that there's a possibility that we risk a version of reverse racism when we engage and lean into the idea of Black excellence? And by that I mean, while we laud the more known and the Phyllis Wheatley amongst us, if the only way that we can get the larger white community to honor our humanity is by holding out the best of us as an example of why we deserve humanity, what happens to the rest of us? What happens to the rest of us that are just average, regular American Blacks trying to make a day, and does our humanity not merit the same care and concern, even if we don't ever end up famous?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer, thank you for that, is yes. And to the way that I try to address that in the book, that is why, there's a painting in the British Art Center and there's a Sandra Bland memorial. And, there are the ways, and there's people who tell stories about their loved ones, and there are people who are some of our greatest artists whose work hangs in museums. Kara Walker's great work that faces Stone Mountain. I don't think anything is at the exclusion of the other. There are a lot of, I don't call them vernacular spaces. Maybe I'd call them everyday spaces. So that's why, an Alvin Ailey ritual dance, to me, gets talked about at the same time that we talk about Black folks on Dixwell Avenue you know, wearing a t-shirt remembering a young person they loved, you know, a young person they loved. I think that all of these things are true at the same time, the value of all of our lives. But I do think, you know, to the specialness of people who in particular are able to make art, who are able to make literature, who are able to go within themselves and give us all that offering. So part of the idea too is to, you know, this is available for anybody. You know, this artwork, these poems that exist forever and ever and ever and ever, and will hopefully outlast some of the evil, right? Those artists do have a special ability that when they are turning it towards us, you know, I think that's very, very, very important. And unfortunately, you know, when I think about the years that I spent as a college professor and thinking about the canon of African American literature and going into so many, you know, all-white cultural spaces, you know, just about literally. Syllabi, my graduate education, museums, classrooms, you know, American literature where somehow there's only white people in it, you know, that work needs to be done as well. So I don't think any of it cancels anything else out. I think it's sort of a song to sing from all corners of the choir. Thank you.
And I think just to follow on that, I mean, we've seen in the narrative of great American literature, writers, authors who elevate the ordinary white man. I mean, literature and theater is littered with that reality of just the ordinary. The ordinary. Let's elevate that. Let's celebrate that. You don't have to be. And so we've seen that happen where great authors, great dramatists have done that for white folks. And so I think it's appropriate that we see great black, great brown, great queer, great doing the same thing for people with whom they have affinity and identify with, who are ordinary, I mean, and who are then elevated just as you're doing, and just as the examples, not only of people like Sandra Bland who are victims of violence, but everyday ordinary black folks. Artists do that in their work. I mean, that's the amazing thing about art. I mean, and this is, when you talk about in the book, you know, art is your religion, and how in so many ways what it gives us as a society, as a community, for fellowship, all the things that you talk about, I think really resonates with this point. But you have another question here, Dr. Alexander.
I want to thank you for your work. My name is Barbara Young from the National Domestic Workers Alliance. But I think that, first, I think that we should be unapologetic for inclusion in American history. You mentioned critical race theory in your comments and just now. One of the things I'm hearing it bandish all around. Shouldn't we be explaining it as it is, the inclusion of Black history into American history, and not just critical race theory, critical race theory? Well, what does that mean? To me, it is the inclusion of bringing Blacks into the history of this country. How do you think that we should be putting it out there in a more understanding way, that young people coming up, not in the way that lawyers present it, but in a way that young people coming up can understand it?
Well, I think that, you know, first of all, I really marvel at the way in which the phrase critical race theory was positively hijacked from Richard Delgado, Derek Bell, and Kim Crenshaw, who, you know, like, and their work. and used to mean something else. So that's thing number one, is what they're talking about is not critical race theory, right? You know, it's in there. They're talking about, you know, justifying racism. So to me, I do feel like I'm not much interested in engaging that. But as a critical race theorist myself, you know, it literally, I mean, like that's, you know, that's what I do as a thinker and a scholar, and I think that, you know, everything I do is about the tools of thinking, of critical thinking, that enable you to say not only what is in front of you, but what is not in front of you. Monticello is in front of you. How did Monticello get built? The great man thinks great thoughts. What labor provided his leisure and ease so that he could think those great thoughts? You know, those kinds of insights about being able to say who's named and who's not are the, the crucial tools of critical race theory that, you know, just for me, myself, are in the work of everything that I do. So.
But one of the things that's so interesting is how, I mean, the whole idea of critical thinking. I mean, think about how much in our education this notion of critical thinking has been exalted. Like, it's the highest compliment, I mean, in the academy. I mean, I remember once in a paper, you know, the professor wrote, this is a really critical analysis, blah, blah, blah. So why is it so hard? Wouldn't critical thinking lead you to think about what's missing? I mean, wouldn't critical thinking lead you to say, how did this plantation get built? I mean, wouldn't a classically trained critical thinker who goes back to the roots, goes back to Aristotle, thinks the things that we were taught in those classics courses, wouldn't that make you say, wow, why are all the people in this prison black? I mean, and so I find it so ironic that critical race theory would be attacked in a society.
You know that word race, come on.
Well, I know, but I mean, of course. But I mean, okay, but take out race. I mean, critical. I mean, just.
But yeah, but that's what, you know, in order to maintain unjust orders, there have to be fictions. And if you take out the critical, then you can keep the fiction.
But you can't have the critical. I mean, but you can't then assert that our democracy is better served, that you're a better scholar, that you are more educated, that the line from, you know, from Aristotle through Voltaire all the way to, that through line wouldn't lead you to this point, wouldn't lead you to an analytical capability of seeing this and asking these questions. So to me, again, it's just the paradox and the hypocrisy of our system, where this, on the one hand, is exalted, and on the other hand, hijacked, as you say. So I don't know. I mean, we know why it's hijacked, but it again reveals the level of inconsistency of theory when applied to issues more broadly, and then when applied to issues of race.
And so that's why, you know, where that just takes me is, again, back to our young people. You know, back to our young people. They know they are vulnerable. You know, they know that the world is a dangerous place for them. They know that they are reviled. They're getting all of these mixed messages on what, you know, the value, what are they supposed to be attaining in their education and in their moving forward. So I think sometimes we have to just sort of go around this too. This is a very blunt book. It's a very plain spoken book. You know, first line of the book, the problem of the 21st century remains the color line. Let's not skirt around it. Let's not be cute. Let's not do anything but talk about why this problem that was supposed to be solved with a forward trajectory is in fact differently entrenched now. And so what are we going to do about it, and how are we going to, you know, again, like, our young people need to be free. Our young people need to be free. What does that look like, and how can we help empower them, and how can we listen to them?
Final question, sir, please.
Yes. It's a question and a statement. One of the things that I noticed between the two of you all is love. And I know that you talked about the love of your sons, or Darren did, but I think it occurred to me watching you talk in the pure glee and joy that comes from the work that you all do, and it is tireless work. You are literally all around the world doing all of this work of representation and reimagination. And so it occurred to me that love is what brought you here. And love is also something that has sustained you, and your love of us, your love of the world, love of the country, and the things that you all have been able to do in the past 5 years through your partnership with so many people here and across the world is unthinkable just 10 years before. And so part of what I'm curious about as you care and speak to the next generation is, tell us, what is your 10 years from now, what can all this love manifest?
The great artist, Hank Willis
That's
Thomas.
a beautiful question.
From Hank. He's such a deep thinker.
I know. I love you.
I love you more.
But what's a serious thing. So, we're going to get briefly personal about my brother here. What I think, no, this is what I want to say, don't go anywhere, is that people are sometimes surprised that our friendship and familyship, because that's what it is, to the grave, is only as old as our working relationship. Darren and I did not know each other before I came to work with him at the Ford Foundation. And through the force of common cause and the exhilaration of doing that work together and the love force, the poet passed recently, the great Caribbean poet Kamau Brathwaite talked about the love axis that propelled the work, that is greater than and constitutive of the brother-sisterhood. So I think that's just an interesting thing to know, what that can mean in one's work. And I don't know what you would say, and as we close, there's something I'd like to read as we close, but I myself don't think about 10 years out because I'm a little bit fatalistic. I really am, and something else we share is sudden loss, out of the blue loss. So I feel like, what are we doing today? What are we doing today? What are we seeding today? And one of the things that I know about teaching that is one of the great joys now with all these students, is Kemi here? Kemi was going to be here. But I'm thinking, I'm only happy in a room where there's a former student. Because you don't know where, you don't know what flowers will grow. And it's just exhilarating at this stage to have generations of students doing the things in ways that we wouldn't have imagined. So students, mentees, let's see what people go on to do. How do you think about the tenure question?
Well, I do like to think about the future, and as you say, I think because we both had a similar loss, it gives you a sense of the urgency of each day to be lived fully. It's why I talk about I drink from the fire hose of life, because I know every day, tomorrow, it could be gone. I think it's really important to be hopeful, because in a time of hopelessness and despair, those of us who do the work that we do, which is highly privileged work, have a responsibility to give people hope. And one of the things we've talked about in your time here at Ford and afterwards is the sense that being in the roles that we are in allows us to bring hope into the room, in part because of who we are. in part because we stand in a place and space on the shoulders of people who made it possible for us to be in these privileged perches. They never could have been. And so our sense of the obligation, the responsibility, the accountability, recognizing that the roles of the Ford Foundation, Mellon Foundation, presidency have been exalted roles, and not being faux humble about it, but owning that responsibility, in part as gatekeepers, whether we like it or not. The gatekeepers decided, as I remember an old-time Ford person saying to me, we decided that we weren't going to fund Alvin Ailey and Dance Theater of Harlem. We would only fund one. We were the gatekeepers. And if the Ford Foundation said it was going to be Dance Theater of Harlem and George Mitchell, well, too bad for Alvin Ailey. He had to wait another 10 years because the mindset was, we're the Ford Foundation. We decide what matters in the arts. And we think there can, in 1968, there can only be one. Even though there is greatness, even though Alvin was equally as brilliant as Mr. Mitchell. The gatekeeper decided.
Well, and the gatekeeper decided, but also I think having a very different philosophy. I mean, you know, that is also scarcity mindset.
Yes.
And that's not how either of us operates in the world. You know, there's never enough. We always want more, but there's always enough. You know, it's never going to be just one person.
Never.
Or just a handful of people.
Well, but to your earlier point, when you operate from an ideology of white supremacy, it then allows you to make that decision out of hand. I mean, of course there can only be one. I mean, there couldn't possibly be more than one of them who are worthy of support from the Ford Foundation. Because the rest of the money has to go to New York City Ballet and Martha Graham and Paul Taylor and Lar Lubavitch and Pina Bausch and all the other people we fund in the dance, all of them. But there can only be one of them.
But I think also what we share and manifest is that, like, we don't like being the only black person in the room.
No.
You know, like that's just an oxygenless room, you know? I mean, so I think having, again, a kind of a, not just fun abundanza, but rather like generative.
Absolutely.
Comrades, the ability to have different ways of looking at the world in the room. You know, that's how we get smarter and stronger, and that's how we solve. And so I'd like to
Please,
read this, yeah.
must allow us one final dazzling.
And I'll say the one thing, you know, we didn't talk as much, there was so much to talk about, but one message, which is Gwendolyn Brooks reminds us, and her work is quoted in here, other people's children must be your children. There's no such thing as other people's children, okay? So even though I often write from the experience of being a mother of these particular children and someone who loves so many other particular children and has taught so many other particular children, it's not about those individuals. It's got to be about, you know, circles radiating outward, and it's got to be about especially caring for our children who are in vulnerable societal positions. But this is how the book ends. Artists make radical solutions all day long. Soup from a stone, beauty from thin air. We see and try and discard and see again. We vision, we invent, we do it in the dark, we bring it into community. Artists continue to generate in a dangerous world that is nonetheless overflowing with life force and power. Creativity, making, and imagining animate Black self-determination with that which only culture can provide. And people make movements and history with the force of creativity. The truly heroic drama of Black struggle is seen in the vivid figurative language of visionary leadership, the tableau of fierce and proud resistance, the blazing beauty of people who survive indignities that might seem unbearable, the style and innovation with which Black people keep on stepping, offering countless examples to remind us of what has been overcome, as well as to spark possibility for envisioning the new. We Black people were largely brought to this soil in the category of property. In the eyes of the law, we were 3/5 human. Out of this status, we became the seers who have continuously articulated the problem, the hope, and the possibility of America. We have expressed the core of what it is to be human and to aspire to better enact that humanity. I believe we have been able to do this because we have accessed near ancestral knowledge and wisdom. For our enslaved progenitors are within reach of memory and lore, still in our families, as well as the energy, courage, and new sight of the young people who so often catalyze our movements. There is no progress without generations working together. And there is no North Star without vigorous creativity to imagine it for us and to mark where it lights the way.
Ladies and gentlemen, Elizabeth Alexander.